Hello everybody, this is International Master Bryan Smith, bringing to you a video from chesslecture.com. This will be another one of my series of theory and practice. What it was is that recently I showed some opening variations, and then I just got the chance to try some of them out in some of my last few tournaments. So here's another one. The last one I did was about Shirov's line against the Philidor defense. This one is related to my earlier video, a poisonous line against the King's Indian Fianchetto variation. So this was my game from the Paleohora Open against International Master Yuri Lipka, and his rating was 24-19. And just a little bit of background on this game. This is the last round of a second tournament I played, and unfortunately I had already screwed up my chances earlier when I lost against Grandmaster Vorobyov after declining a draw. So I really had this was the last round, and I had no chance to win a prize or to get a norm. And when I saw my pairing, I was kind of happy because I had prepared with someone else for this guy, someone else who I knew was playing this guy, and I prepared with him. And I saw that this guy was a big fan of the draw. And that was, well, it made me happy not because I wanted a draw, actually. I would have decided to play for a win even though I had black, but just because it gives me a, psychological initiative, and also, just in general, probably he didn't want to play in the last round. There was nothing for him to play for, or me. But I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to try out this variation because I knew he played the King's Indian Fianchetto, and I was excited about this variation, which I showed in an earlier video. And also, I just wanted to end the tournament on a positive note. So here's how the game went. He started off with knight f3. So, of course, many different move orders to get to a King's Indian. And good thing about that opening is that, unlike some other openings answering to d4, other closed defenses, King's Indian can be played against knight f3 on the first move, usually, against c4. Against various moves, you can play King's Indian and reach the same positions or similar positions, which you can't do, for example, with a Nimzo Indian. If that's your main opening, it's really hard to transpose into a Nimzo Indian from c4, for instance, on the first move. But after knight f3, you can play the same way as black in the King's Indian. So knight f3, I played g6, and of course white has ways to avoid it, like he could play e4 here, and then maybe c5, and it'll be some sort of dragon. Hyper-accelerated dragon. But he wasn't going to do that, as I knew his style was a very solid player. So he played d4, and I played knight f6, not giving him a second chance to play e4. Now he played c4, and I played bishop g7. He played g3, and I castled. Bishop g2. So we've played a Fianchetto variation. d6, he castled, and now knight b to d7. So this, of course, is the point where the roads fork. Black can play c5, black can play knight c6, some other moves like c6, but here I played knight d7, just as in the video that I showed you. But heading into this system, which I really wanted to try out, he played knight c3, I played e5, and he played e4. These are all the main moves. Of course, instead of knight c3, white has a kind of dangerous system, queen c2 and rook d1. It's not the most popular, it's not considered the most critical, but it's something which you should put some time into if you're going to play this as black. But anyway, knight c3, I played e5, he played e4, and I took, which is not the most common move, but is the one I wanted to try out and which I showed in my video. The most common move here is probably c6, I guess, with the idea after h3, which is typical. White just defends g4 against later on black maybe moving the bishop there in the future or the knight there. It's just a good, useful move. And then queen b6. This is a very common variation. And white has the move c5. But I played my knight e takes d4. And now he took back with the knight. Rook e8. And I was happy to see, he played h3, and I get to go into my system. Here there are a couple other choices for white. Bishop e3 is something someone actually played in my very last tournament, a small tournament here. I was not a very strong player, but this is a system, and the idea is to play f3. But in general, black's position is pretty good. White solidifies e4, but on the other hand, he's a little bit passive. He's blocking his bishop in, and he's also creating some weaknesses when he plays f3, because after knight c5, pretty much have to play f3. Because of queen c2, there's knight g4, which gets the bishop, and that's a very serious accomplishment for black. But my opponent played h3. Also, there's rook e1, which is this is probably more serious alternative than bishop e3, but again, black can play knight c5, and then h3 will transpose to my game. And the only other options are b4 or knight b3, both of which lead to kind of independent play. But anyway, my opponent played h3. I played knight c5, and he played rook e1, and I received the expected draw offer. And I thought about it for a little bit, because if I play my next move, I'm kind of revealing what system I play against this. So later on, maybe some of my opponents have a better chance to prepare. But I figured this was silly. That's the experience of, practicing such a position is more important than my opponent knowing that I might play it in the future. So I wanted to play on, and I played bishop d7, which is the system I recommended in my video. And the main difference here from the old line is a5, keeping white from playing b4, but black's not so worried about b4, in my system. And also the a5 allows the move knight to b5, which is a possibility. So anyway, bishop d7 is what I played. And he played bishop f4, which is one of the main moves. So actually, after bishop d7, he now had to start thinking, which is going to be the typical situation. This is not the most popular line. And this is the point where people will start thinking typically. And some of them will come up with awful stuff. But after bishop d7, okay, he played a normal move, bishop f4. There's lots of different moves, and you can look at my video, which covers the theory much more in depth. I wanted to show instead how this actually worked out in a tournament game. There's moves like rook b1, king h2, bishop f4. Also, an important thing is queen c2 is met by knight takes e4, which also is discussed in that video, because not at this point, white can't play queen c2 at all, because he just loses a pawn. But in a little bit. In general, knight takes e4 is the response after queen c2. So anyway, he played bishop f4, and now I played h6, which again is what I recommended in my video, and it looks like a really mysterious move, but the thing is, black has got all his pieces developed. Now we're going to stay flexible and see what white does. But also we're going to prevent him from getting to an ideal setup. And the key thing is, look, white's queen has a little bit of a problem, because one of the points of h6 is queen d2 is met by g5 now, followed by knight takes e4 after bishop e3. So g5 is a move that typically black doesn't want to play because it's kind of anti-positional, but here it wins a pawn and it's worth it. So queen d2 is out, and queen to c2 is met by can be met by knight takes e4. And this is the main thing. We want to keep white from, of course, getting his ideal setup, queen c2 and then the rook to d1. And this is very important to prevent white from doing that, because then he'll have great prospects if he manages that. I'm not saying black's position will be terrible, but white will be very happy if that happens. So we want to try to use tactics to prevent white from, to keep white a little bit uncomfortable at least. And knight takes e4 doesn't win a pawn. You can look at my other video to see the analysis here. It doesn't win a pawn, but it leads to various different variations which are okay for black or sometimes quite good for black. So, and it can win a pawn also in some cases. White can sacrifice, but it looks okay. And there's also some other moves I recommended after queen c2 were also possible, like queen to c8 meeting king h2 with knight to g4 was some other possibility when the d4 knight is under attack. But he didn't play queen c2. He played rook to b1, and this was a point where it's also a logical move, and this is the point where I had to start thinking, because h6 is automatic. It stops the queen from moving, also clears h7 in some cases for the knight, and guards g5 square. So, for example, after b4, There's knight e6, and then if the bishop retreats, then one possibility is knight g5. There's also here another thing, which I discussed in my other video, knight takes d4 followed by c5 tactic, which you can see by looking at that one. But anyway, rook to b1, very logical move, useful. White stays flexible as well. Takes his rook off the dangerous long diagonal, possibly prepares b4. Now I needed to start thinking what I'm going to do. First of all, I don't want him to be able to play queen c2 still, so I have to be watching for that. So really, my choices here are moves. There are several moves, actually lots of moves. The move I played, which was a5, and a6 is also a possibility. This is, often black faces this choice. a5 trying to cramp white and also keep the knight on c5, or a6 preparing eventually to play b5. Also, I could play queen to c8, king h2, and then a6, where there are some subtle differences. And perhaps the safest move is just knight e6. Now, knight e6, white probably has to take, because after bishop e3, there's knight to g5, which is real annoying for white, threatening h3 and e4. So this is a common tactic. White will have to take it, unfortunately for him. And once that happens, black's pretty happy. The dark squared bishop is a very important piece. So black's is now unopposed, and whenever things open up, the bishop's going to be happy. So that makes the game pretty pleasant for black. So after knight e6, white should probably take. Bishop takes. Now c4 is hanging. So knight to d5 is logical. And now, typically after this move, black avoids the trade, which might seem a little bit unusual, considering that black does have less space. Usually you want to exchange pieces. But we want to, first of all, we definitely don't want to take on d5, which will really increase white's space advantage. Knight takes d5 would be a really bad move. After c takes d5, bishop d7, black really has no compensation at all for white's wonderful cramp that he has on black's position and pressure on the queen's side. So the c file in particular. So very, very bad for black to take on d5. There would just be no counter chances. And instead, black would want to keep the knight, which has great prospects, going to e5 or c5, and meanwhile, keep the possibility of chasing white's knight back with c6. So, d5 square looks nice. The knight looks nice there. Of course, we can chase it back with c6. It's sort of, d5 is sort of like a pseudo outpost for white. It's a good square. Technically, black can chase it back, although it does weaken the d-pawn when he does it. However, that may not be so important at all times here. Black can defend the d-pawn, and meanwhile, white's position has certain weaknesses of its own. The c-pawn, the dark squares in general, and black's pieces are very well coordinated, and he looks like he's cramped, but his pieces all have pretty much freedom here. So after knight d5, knight d7, now black would be threatening c6 to a certain extent, because after knight moves, then knight e5, hitting the c-pawn again, and then basically the knight will have to retreat to e3 and block white's bishop, and it's almost trapped. So b3 is logical, and then black can play a5, for instance, planning a4 to try to open up the a file or get that pawn closer to its queening square on a1, which is nicely guarded by black's fianchettoed bishop. These silly things like this, it's not totally silly. This can be a factor as the game goes on. And also, if white plays b4 after a4, then c4 pawn can be weak again. So I think that this is fairly safe type of position for black. He doesn't really have weaknesses. White always has to be on the lookout for c6, chasing the knight back at some point. And this is, it looks reasonably playable for black. And this was a game Masseya versus, or sorry, not Masseya, it was Hubner versus Schmaltz from 2001. So knight e6 looks like the safest move here if you're considering actually reaching this position. But what I played was a5. I didn't really want to play safe type of position like that. I wanted to keep it complicated, especially since it looked like my opponent was more at home in kind of quiet positional type of games. So a5, and I'm planning to play a4 and cramp the queen side a little bit. So he played b3, which I expected, and now I played a4. So this is my plan. I want to weaken the c4 square and create some tension on the queen side. Now he doesn't want me to take because I'll get the open a file, and this is very common in these positions in the King's Indian. The open a file, the bishop from g7 is guarding a1 in many cases. White has to be very careful there. So the open a file often falls into black's hands. Not to mention that then b3 will be weakened. So he played b4 and he kept the a file closed. And I played knight e6, and now he has to take probably because if bishop e3, again knight g5 is annoying. You don't want to have to give up that bishop if you're white. And right now black's threatening h3 and also e4, so that's actually what white has to do. So he doesn't want to do that. He took on e6. Also, I'm threatening various things. So the knight's not well enough guarded on d4, so I'm threatening taking, and if the queen has to take back, then various discoveries like knight takes e4. So he took on e6. I took with a bishop. Now I'm threatening c4. And he played knight to d5, a logical move, keeping c4 guarded, or blocking c4. There's queen e2, but he didn't really want to have his queen opposed to my rook, and that's probably not the best move. So knight to d5. Now again, I played knight to d7, like in the similar thing. The knight has very good square on e5, and even though that's also not an outpost, white can drive it back with f4. That's a double-edged thing for white to do, to drive the knight back, weakening his position, overextending it a little bit more, too. So, and also, meanwhile, I want to chase his knight back at some point and gain time like that. So here was a key position, and he made a mistake. He didn't want to play something, actually what I'm threatening now is c6 followed by knight e5. After which he's going to have to give up his bishop. He didn't want to have to, or knight e5 and then c6. He didn't want to have to play queen c2, knight e5, and at some point then let's say he plays rook to d1, c6, and at some point g5. Maybe not right away, or maybe even right away, but forcing him to give up the bishop. And this would, it would weaken my f5 square, but my bishop is guarding that, and most likely when he plays knight f5 I'll take. We'll reach an opposite colored bishop position where maybe I'm a little bit better. Or it's at least even and pretty comfortable for black. I'm not sure I would play g5 immediately though here. I think I would keep him waiting for a while. But he didn't feel this was comfortable to have his bishop locked in on f4. So he played bishop d2 immediately, so that after c6 he would be able to retreat his knight to e3 and not have to give up his bishop at some point. But this was too passive and also at the same time a little too optimistic, and could lead to serious trouble. He's moved his pieces several times. So actually the best move was rook to c1. Not necessarily the easiest move to find, because it looks more natural to move the queen somewhere and guard the c-pawn that way. But this would be a good move. And this was what happened in the game Masseya versus Sarnata from 2008. And here, the point is that if c6, white's not forced to retreat his knight to e3, he can play bishop takes d6. Because if c takes d5, then c takes d5. And black's bishop is trapped, so white gets the piece back with a big advantage. So c6 is not good. Black could play knight e5, and then that's what happened. And Masseya played another good move, bishop e3. So the point is now if c6, then white can come into, bishop b6 followed by knight to c7, winning the exchange. So here, then black just played a3, which looks reasonable, and f4, knight to d7. And actually black ended up winning this game, although it looked a little bit dubious. Still, even though white's kind of accomplished something here, driving black's pieces back, his position is a little bit overextended, so you have to be very careful, and the game can reverse really quickly, which is what happened in that game, where lower-rated player Sarnata beats a strong grandmaster Masseya with the black pieces. Of course, black is threatening c6 here, followed by taking on c4. So it's not so simple for white, and he ended up losing, although it's probably a good position for white. So maybe instead of a5, maybe black should look into that knight e6 or one of those other moves if you want to keep the game complicated. a6 or queen c8, back at the point, back on move 15. So, but anyway, my opponent didn't find the subtle idea of rook c1 followed by bishop e3, which I have to say is not that easy to find, and it's pretty impressive play from Macedo, at least for those couple of moves. He played bishop to d2, and now could have got in big trouble. So what I played was knight e5. He played queen to c2, guarding his pawn, which he pretty much has to do. And here was a crucial point for me to find a good move. Of course, it's obvious there's knight takes c4, which is what I was calculating at first. He would take, and then I would play c6. And I can't remember everything I was looking at. Probably b5 or something like this, or maybe rook to d1 or something, since the rook's going to be under attack. C takes, e takes, bishop f5, and basically position becomes somewhat around even, and I wasn't quite satisfied with it. Maybe b5 was more what I thought, actually, because this clears b4 for the bishop. C takes, e takes, bishop f5, rook takes, queen takes, rook e1, queen can't go to d7 because g4, so queen to c8. Well, basically, I decided somehow that position would be about even, and I wasn't quite satisfied with that. I wanted to keep the game complicated, and maybe I'm a little bit worse there too. I don't know what's going on. I didn't look recently, so I didn't play that. And I looked, of course, at queen to d7, and I saw that white has a very strong answer to this, which was, doesn't lose for me immediately, but I didn't want to deal with it. And then I got lost in thought and started thinking about knight c4 again. And then I started looking at queen d7 and trying to make a little improvement. If king h2, then knight takes c4. And I looked at various lines there. So queen takes c6, knight b6, queen d8, sorry. And followed by, and the queen can't guard the knight, and calculated other variations, decided the queen was better on d7 before taking c4, and completely forgot about the answer to queen d7, which any 1400 player will see very quickly. And I'll actually give you a minute to, you can pause the video and find what white does after queen d7. Okay, it's a very basic tactic, bishop takes h6, which I saw but I forgot about. And I had looked at it briefly to see if maybe I can allow that, but I decided, no, that's silly. But now I had to, because right after I moved, then I realized that I forgot about this, and so I had to live with it. But fortunately, the game wasn't lost. However, here, and I'll give you another problem, which is what should black do? And this one's a little bit harder. Black can take over the initiative and get a absolutely wonderful position, which would have just been a joy to play if I had found the right moves. Unfortunately, I didn't. So I'll give you a minute. Maybe you should pause it a little bit longer if you really want to try to find the answer. It's not that easy, but what would you do here? Okay, I think it's fairly obvious at first, and I looked at it briefly, but I rejected it, probably because I was being a little bit dogmatic. The answer is c6, which is a natural move, of course, and I looked at that. Knight e3, and now very strong move b5, which pretty much forces white to take on b5. Since if bishop f1 guarding the pawn, of course, there's knight f3. And if c5, then I think black just takes, and white has to take back with a pawn. And probably there's some knight to d3 type tactics here. But in any case, this is also good position for black too. No, sorry, bishop takes h3 is a very strong tactic then, if this happens, with the same idea that he used. And the funny thing was, and during the game, I was looking for a bishop takes h3 tactic, and I missed the bishop takes h6 tactic. So anyway, after this, then there would be queen takes d2. And if queen takes, then knight f3 followed by knight takes d2. And black wins 2 pawns, because e4 then will be hanging also. So that can't be played. So white would have to take on b5, and black takes back. And position is just wonderful for black. I have the c4 square. His knight is stuck guarding that. If my knight comes into c4, I'll be very happy. Rook is coming to c8 with tempo. Queen will come to b6. I'll take over the c-file. Queen has to guard a2, or something has to guard a2. There's no spot for the queen. He has to watch d3 as well. And basically all of white's pieces are stuck in their position, and there's virtually no plan. I don't know really what he can do here. He has to play something like maybe rook to c1 and then retreat the queen to b1. But in any case, I wouldn't say it's absolutely won for black, but it's an extremely pleasant position for black to play, and also a big advantage. So just a slight misstep, and this is what could happen. Of course, I didn't find it, and I think part of the reason was, I was tired at the end of the tournament, but that's not an excuse. Part of the reason was probably that I was a little dogmatic about leaving my d6 pawn isolated, which is silly, because this d6 so-called weakness is not really weak, because white can't attack it. He doesn't have the initiative, so he can't attack it. And meanwhile, his own weaknesses are much more relevant. The a2 pawn, which, according to standard, principles, it's not backward, it's not isolated, nothing, but it's actually very weak. And c4 square, d3 square, and he has to watch out for other kinds of tactics with bishop takes h3. So it's just really difficult position for white, and this is a reason not to cling to, to these type of ideas like I can never have an isolated pawn or something like this. And of course, I've seen people make this type of positional, can't even call it a positional sacrifice, but this type of structure into King's Indian. There's a very famous game between Karpov and Kasparov where Kasparov surprisingly took back with his c-pawn in a situation where he could have played a takes b5, and it was justified. And I've seen this before, and I've done it myself too. But in this case, for some reason, I didn't appreciate the strength of simple c6 and b5, which my opponent pointed out after the game. Instead, I played queen d7, and I'll show you now the interesting finish to the game. He took h6, and now I took d5, which was the only move. If bishop takes h3, he would take g7, and now the threat of knight to f6 forces me to take back, and then he can play f4, and if the knight moves, then queen to c3 check, followed by knight f6. So I would have to take g2, then he can take e5, and the bishop is hanging. If bishop f3, then white can play e6 followed by queen to c3 check, forking the king and the bishop on f3 after black takes e6. If bishop h3, then knight f6 wins the exchange, and black doesn't get enough compensation. In general, these variations were just very bad. I tried to find something, but I couldn't. So I took d5. He took g7, which is forced, because now the knight is no longer there, so I'll just take the bishop if he recaptures on d5. And now if I just take back, he takes on d5 with a clear extra pawn, so I needed to continue with the desperado. Bishop takes e4. And here he faced a kind of difficult decision. He needs to take the bishop, but which way? He ended up taking with his own bishop, which actually wins the exchange, and in fact basically leads to a forced draw, which of course he didn't see, and neither did I at this point, but it's seemingly safer. But queen takes c4 was better. I mean, this was the move I was most worried about. Of course I have to take actually I have two choices here. I was hoping to be able to make king takes g7 work, and then after queen takes b7, knight to d3 with some crazy ideas. I'm down a pawn, but his queen gets out of play, and I start to target some weaknesses like f2, and b1 rook can be hanging after queen f5, and this type of stuff. So the point is rook takes e8, and if bishop to c6, which of course wins lots of material, I have queen f5, threatening f2. And if he guards that simply, then I have rook e1, and black is winning then, apparently. Well, there's queen to c8. So maybe rook to e2 is stronger. But in any case, black has a very, very good counter attack. And actually it's in great shape there. So, and if bishop takes e8, then I take f2, king h1, queen takes g3, threatening mate on f2. And looked, like extremely dangerous for white. Of course, it's actually a forced draw after queen g2. I would have to give perpetual check. Knight takes h3, and so on. If king f1, then queen d3, forking the king and rook. So he would have to go back to h1, and the game would be a draw. However, it doesn't look like this variation is sound, because instead of bishop c6, greedily grabbing the rook, white can play very strong re-centralizing move, queen to d5, and the position is just overwhelming. This doesn't allow my queen to get into the game. We see how important centralization is. He stops queen f5. Of course, he's threatening my knight. My knight has to just retreat, and then I'm just down a pawn with a terrible position as well. Of course, he'll just push his queenside pawns, and his bishop is stronger than the knight, so that's hopeless. So actually, I can't play king g7. I would have to rely on knight c6, and then I get my piece back. He moves his queen, I take. But and it's even material, but position is much better for white, because his bishop is stronger than my knight, and I have some weaknesses, and the long diagonal is very good for him. So this is a pleasant advantage for white. That's what he should have done. But surprisingly, after my blunder, there's no direct forced win as far as I can tell. Anyway, he took on e4 with his bishop. Of course, I took back. Now he took b7. And if I move my rook, he just goes back to g2, and I can resign, because I have down a pawn, and his bishop is stronger, and his king is safe. So, of course, it was not hard to make the decision to sacrifice the exchange. So I took h3. And now he could play bishop g2 and try to be subtle after queen g4, or queen h5, rather, probably. Then come back and take, but actually that improves the position of my queen, as we'll see in a second. So he took right away. If he doesn't take, then knight g4 is coming, and rook h8, and so on. So I'll have, and it's even material, so it'll have a good position. So he took, I took back. Now I'm threatening knight f3 mate, so he had to make another decision, and he played the safe move, rook takes e5, which was right, I think. He could play and try to win. Well, I'm not sure he saw everything that it forced a draw. But anyway, he could play, try to keep the exchange with, for example, queen e4, guarding f3 and guarding g2. Queen c3 wouldn't be good because rook h8, threatening mate on h1, and this would lead to a win for black. There's no stopping it except pushing f-pawn, and then the king gets chased out. Instead, queen e4, but after rook h8, black actually has wonderful compensation for the exchange and big attack, and it's very hard for white to play. Right now, the main threat is queen to h5 followed by knight f3. Of course, there are knight takes c4 tactics. Black can grab a pawn back, but the main thing is just white's rooks can't get into the game. The knight on e5 is as strong as a rook, and the light squares around white's king are permanently weak. The king is never going to be safe, and open h-file is very dangerous. So I can't really find good moves for white here. After, for example, rook d1, I would play queen h5, threatening knight f3. And and of course, if white's rook e3 is impossible because the rook is hanging on d1. So it's very difficult for white to find good moves in this position. So, and I think he decided correctly that was too dangerous. So he took e5. And interestingly, this actually leads to a forced draw. So I could take back e5. Of course, he's going to play queen e4, and then after rook h8, it transposes the game. So I play the slightly more cute move, rook h8 right away, threatening mate on h1. It's also more forcing, so that makes sense. He has to play queen e4, so stopping the mate. And now I took e5, which I have to do, pretty much. If I play queen h2, he plays king f1, queen h1 check. Then not queen takes h1, because this leads to a lost endgame for white. After the king moves, wherever it moves to e2 or g2, black takes, and white's pawns are falling. b4 is threatened, the rook is also threatened, but instead of that, he would play king to e2, and then the rook is guarded on b1 and my queen is hanging, so I would lose. So he's still up a rook. So instead I took on e5. Actually, I'm not sure, did I check first? No, actually I took right away. And he took the pawn, which for a second I thought was he had fallen into a trap and I would win. I was happy for a second. Then I saw he has a draw. If he played something like queen g2, on the other hand, I would just play queen h5, and black has a great position because white's king is in trouble. Still, the h file is dangerous, and black has the centralization, and white's c4 and b4 pawns are weak. Basically that's not a huge advantage for black, but a pretty big advantage. So he was right to take the pawn. I play king to f8. So now if, for example, queen c5, I just go king g8, and there's no more checks, I'm threatening mate. So he had to guard against mate on h1, so he played queen to d5. Now I play queen to h2, he played king to f1. I give a check, and of course he can't trade queens because he'll just be down a rook. His rook on b1 will be skewered. But unfortunately for me, after king e2, I have nothing better than to take the rook. And then he has perpetual check, surprisingly enough. Queen to d8, king g7, queen d4. If I go to h6 or h7, he has queen h4. Actually, I can't go to h6 because the rook is hanging. But if I go to h7, then queen h4, king g7, or if king g8, then queen to d8, king g7, queen d4. If f6 gets played, then he goes queen d7, gives checks on the d file if my king stays back, and if it comes up to h6, then queen h3, and I can't go king g5 because of f4 mate. So it's actually a draw. If I desperately needed to win at this point, rather than checking on h1, I could have tried rook h5. But after queen to d8, king g7, queen d4, king h7, king e2, stopping the threat of queen h1, black is down a pawn, and sure, white's king is running around. It looks a little dangerous, but I couldn't find anything clear. And maybe, it was worth considering. But if I really needed to win, because he was in time pressure as well, and I wasn't. If I really needed to win, I could have tried this, but it didn't look right. Maybe black has some chances, but it just didn't seem correct to me. So I hope you've enjoyed this kind of silly but interesting game, but also seeing how this system worked out in practice and how even a very strong, solid player can easily get into big trouble with the white pieces against the system, which is why I call it poisonous. This has been International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for OnlineChessLessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from OnlineChessLessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.